Mom, why are you still renting? I bought you a house last year. I set my fork down slowly, the way you do when you're buying yourself a few seconds to make sure you heard something right. Around us, the restaurant hummed with Mother's Day chatter, clinking glasses, a toddler laughing 2 tables over, a waiter reciting the specials to a couple who weren't listening. And in the middle of all that ordinary noise, my son had just said something that made the floor tilt under my chair. "Daniel," I said carefully. "What house?" He laughed, that easy, confident CEO laugh he'd developed somewhere between his second funding round and his first magazine cover. "The house on Larkspur, Mom. The 3-bedroom with the wraparound porch you always said you loved when we drove past it. I closed on it in March last year. I told you I was handling it." I stared at him. My apartment, the 1-bedroom above a dry cleaner on Fenwood Street, the one with the radiator that clanks like a dying engine every winter, the one where I've paid rent every single month for the last 6 years, sat in my mind like a slap. "Daniel," I said again, quieter this time. "I have never set foot in a house on Larkspur Street. I still live on Fenwood. I paid my rent 3 days ago." The table went silent. And that's when she reached over and put her hand on his arm, Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, in a blush pink dress that probably cost more than 2 months of my rent, her nails freshly done, her smile arriving a half-second too late to feel natural. "Sweetheart," she said to him, voice smooth as poured honey. "I think Mom might just be confused. You know how these things get mixed up." I looked at her. I looked at my son. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt something cold and clear settle into my chest, the feeling of a woman who has just realized she is standing at the edge of something much bigger than a misunderstanding. If you've ever sat at a table and felt the ground shift under a single sentence, you know exactly what that moment feels like. Drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to know where this story is reaching. And if this pulls you in the way it pulled me through living it, hit like. It helps this story find the people who need to hear it. Now let me take you back to where it actually started, because by the time we got to that restaurant table, the lie had already been growing for over a year. My name is Carol Bennett. I'm 64 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of woman nobody worried about, because I never gave anyone a reason to. I raised Daniel alone after his father left when Daniel was 7, no drama, no lawyers, just a note on the kitchen counter and a car that pulled out of the driveway one morning and never came back. I worked 2 jobs for a stretch of years I don't like to think about too hard. Daytime at a dental office answering phones, evenings doing the books for a hardware store that's not there anymore. I made sure Daniel had shoes that fit and a lunch that wasn't embarrassing and someone in the stands at every single basketball game, even the ones where he sat on the bench the whole time. He was a smart kid. Smarter than the town we lived in, honestly. Full scholarship to a state engineering program, then a master's degree he half-financed himself by tutoring other students in calculus. I remember the day he called me from a payphone, if you can believe that, to tell me he'd gotten his first real job offer. I cried in my kitchen for 20 minutes after I hung up. That was 14 years ago. Today, Daniel is the founder and CEO of Verdant Systems, a logistics and supply chain software company that went from 4 people in a rented office to something investors talk about at conferences. He's been on the cover of a regional business magazine. He drives a car I couldn't pronounce the name of if you asked me to. He lives in a glass and stone house on a hill outside the city with views that stretch out over 3 counties. And I still live on Fenwood Street, above the dry cleaner, in a 1-bedroom apartment with a radiator I've learned to live with. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I never asked Daniel for money. Not once. I raised him to be generous because that's who I am, not because I expected anything back. When he married Vanessa 6 years ago, I welcomed her the way I would have welcomed any woman my son loved. She was polished and charming and always said exactly the right thing at exactly the right time, the kind of charm that, looking back now, should have made me a little more curious about what was underneath it. About 18 months ago, Daniel started talking about taking care of me. He'd call and say things like, "Mom, you shouldn't be paying rent at your age," or "I want you somewhere safe, somewhere that's actually yours." I told him I appreciated it, but I didn't need charity. He laughed and said it wasn't charity, it was family. Then, last spring, he told me he'd found the perfect place, a house on Larkspur Street, not far from a park I used to walk through when he was small. He said Vanessa was going to handle the paperwork because she'd worked in real estate before they got married and knew how to navigate closings, title transfers, all of it. I remember exactly what I said to him that day, because it feels important now. I said, "Just make sure my name is on it, sweetheart. That's all I ask." He laughed and said, "Mom, of course it will be. Vanessa's got it covered." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I raised him to be honest, and I had no reason to think his wife was anything other than what she appeared to be. For the next year, whenever I asked about the house, I got smooth, confident answers. "It's an escrow, Mom. There's a title issue we're clearing up. Vanessa's dealing with an inspection thing, don't worry about it." Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Strung together, over 16 months, they should have told me something. But I trusted my son, and I trusted the woman he married, and trust is a hard habit to break even when the evidence is quietly piling up in the corner of the room. Until Mother's Day, when Daniel looked at me across a restaurant table and asked why I was still renting a house he believed he'd already given me. There's another piece of this I should tell you, because it matters for what comes later. About 2 years ago, before any of this started, I helped Daniel through a rough stretch at Verdant Systems. A key investor had pulled out unexpectedly, and for about 4 months, cash flow was tight enough that Daniel was quietly delaying his own salary to keep the company afloat. I didn't have much, but I had a small emergency fund I'd built up over decades of careful saving, and I wired him $11,000 without a second thought. He paid every cent of it back within the year, with interest I never asked for, and he told me more than once that it was the reason the company survived long enough to land the contract that turned everything around. I bring this up not to make myself sound like a saint, but because it tells you something about the relationship Daniel and I actually had. There was real trust between us, built over years, tested in both directions. That's exactly why what happened later cut as deep as it did. It wasn't a stranger who took advantage of me. It was someone standing inside a circle of trust I'd spent a lifetime building with my son. I also want to be honest about something else. In the months leading up to that Mother's Day dinner, there had been small moments that, looking back, I brushed past too easily. Once, at a family barbecue, I overheard Vanessa on the phone in the kitchen, her voice hushed, saying something about the booking calendar and getting the cleaning crew scheduled before the weekend. At the time I assumed she meant something to do with Daniel's office, some corporate retreat house maybe. Another time, she mentioned almost offhandedly that she'd picked up a little side project managing a rental property, and laughed it off as something to keep her busy since she'd stepped back from her real estate job after the wedding. I remember nodding along, thinking how nice it was that she'd found something to fill her days. I had no idea I was listening to a confession dressed up as small talk. If you're the kind of person who would have caught on sooner than I did, tell me in the comments. I want to know what red flag would have stopped you first. For me, it took a public restaurant and a direct question to finally see what had been sitting in front of me the whole time. I didn't say much else at dinner. I let Daniel apologize for the confusion, let Vanessa smooth things over with a story about a paperwork delay at the title company, let the waiter bring dessert I didn't taste. I hugged my son goodbye in the parking lot, told him I loved him, and drove back to Fenwood Street with my hands tight on the wheel the entire way. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I never touched and a legal pad I'd bought years ago for grocery lists. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote 2 words, "Find the deed." The next morning, I called the county recorder's office. I gave them the address on Larkspur Street and asked for a copy of the current deed of record. It took the clerk less than 3 minutes to come back on the line. "Ma'am, I do have a property matching that address," she said. "Purchased March 14th of last year. Would you like me to read you the owner of record?" "Please," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The deed is held by Larkspur Holdings LLC," she said. "Registered agent listed as Vanessa Bennett." I sat very still for a long moment after I hung up the phone. Not my name. Not Daniel's name. An LLC, controlled by my daughter-in-law, holding a house my son believed he'd bought for me. I want to pause here and tell you something I've learned over 64 years. Anger is loud, but it isn't always useful. What I felt sitting in my kitchen that morning wasn't rage. It was something colder and far more useful. I was awake, in a way I hadn't been in a long time. I called the title company listed on the county record next, a small firm 2 towns over. I explained, as calmly as I could manage, that I believed there might have been an error on a property purchased in my son's name. The woman on the phone, a kind-voiced clerk named Rosa, pulled the file while I waited. "I do see the transaction," she said slowly. "The funds came from an account under Verdant Systems, wired as an executive gift disbursement. But the closing paperwork lists Larkspur Holdings LLC as the buyer, with Vanessa Bennett signing as managing member. There's a notarized letter in the file stating the property was being purchased on behalf of, and I'm reading this directly, a family member who prefers privacy in property matters." A letter. Notarized. Explaining away why my name wasn't on a house my son thought he'd given me. "Was that letter signed by my son?" I asked. "No, ma'am," Rosa said. "It's signed only by Vanessa Bennett, as authorized agent." I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat in my small kitchen above the dry cleaner for a long time, listening to the radiator clank in the next room, thinking about a house on a hill I had never once been invited to see. I called Daniel's company that afternoon. I asked, as casually as I could, whether he knew a public records search could confirm exactly who owned a property. He laughed and said, "Mom, why would you need to do that? I told you, it's handled." I didn't push. Some fights aren't won with a phone call. They're won by quietly building something no one can talk their way out of. That same week, I drove to Trinity Savings, the small credit union where I'd banked for over 30 years, and asked to speak with someone about a wire transfer I believed had been made in my name the previous spring. The branch manager, a patient man named Oscar who'd known me since Daniel was in middle school, pulled up my account history right there at the counter. There was nothing. No incoming wire, no deposit, no record of any transaction connected to a home purchase. Just the same modest balance I'd carried for years, rising and falling with my rent and my groceries and the occasional gift I sent Daniel's kids at Christmas. "Mrs. Bennett," Oscar said gently, sliding the printout across the counter to me, "if a house had been purchased in your name, even indirectly, there'd usually be some kind of paper trail hitting this account, insurance setup, a tax escrow notice, something. There's nothing here at all." I stood in the parking lot afterward with the printout folded in my purse, feeling the particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. For 16 months I had thanked my son quietly in my own head every time I paid my rent, telling myself it was temporary, that the house was coming, that good things sometimes take time to arrange. I had never once imagined that the delay itself was the lie. That evening, I opened a spiral notebook, the plain kind, not fancy, the kind I used to use for grocery lists when Daniel was small, and I began writing everything down. Every phone call. Every date. Every excuse Daniel had repeated to me over the past 16 months, word for word as best I remembered them. Every conversation with Vanessa where she'd smoothly changed the subject whenever I asked to see the house. I have always believed that numbers don't lie, even when people do, and I intended to build a record so complete that no honeyed voice could talk its way around it. If you were in my shoes at that kitchen table, would you have confronted Vanessa immediately, or would you have kept building the file quietly the way I did? Tell me below, I really do want to know. A week later, I decided to drive past the house on Larkspur Street. I told myself I just wanted to see it, nothing more. I parked across the street under an oak tree and looked at a beautiful 3-bedroom home with a wraparound porch, exactly the one I'd admired years ago when Daniel and I used to drive past it on the way to his old Little League games. There were flower boxes on the windowsills. A wreath on the door, even though it wasn't near any holiday. It looked lived in. Then a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway, and a young couple got out with suitcases, laughing, checking their phones like they were following directions. A man in his 30s walked around from the side yard with a set of keys and handed them over with a smile, gesturing toward the porch like he was welcoming them somewhere. I sat in my car and watched a total stranger check into what was supposed to be my house. When I got home, I searched the address on my laptop, the way my church group's tech-savvy granddaughter had shown me a few months earlier. It took less than 2 minutes to find it, a short-term rental listing, charming Larkspur Cottage, 4.5 stars, 81 reviews, booked almost every weekend for the past year. The host's profile name was V. Bennett Properties. I sat back in my chair and let that settle over me. My son believed he had bought his mother a home. Instead, his wife had quietly turned that home into a business, collecting rental income under her own name, month after month, while I paid my own rent above a dry cleaner 3 miles away. I called Rosa at the title company again the next morning and asked, as gently as I could manage, whether an LLC like Larkspur Holdings would be required to file any kind of annual report showing its income. She explained that as a private LLC, that information wouldn't be public record, but she mentioned, almost as an aside, that a forensic accountant could often trace deposit patterns if I ever needed to build a formal case. That was the moment I understood I couldn't do this alone anymore. I called my late husband's cousin, Frank Delgado, a retired detective who now did private investigative work on the side, mostly locating deadbeat fathers for the county. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the way good investigators do, and when I finished he said something I've carried with me ever since. "Carol," he said, "you don't need to catch her lying. You need to make it impossible for her to lie anymore. That's a different job, and it takes patience." Over the next 3 weeks, Frank helped me quietly gather what we needed. Printouts of the rental listing and its full booking history. A copy of the notarized letter from the title company file. Bank records Daniel didn't know I'd asked his finance department for, using nothing more than my status as an authorized family contact on record from years earlier when I'd helped him incorporate the business out of my own kitchen table. Those records showed something Frank said was the clearest piece of the whole picture: a separate account, opened under Larkspur Holdings LLC, receiving weekly rental deposits, then transferring smaller amounts every few weeks into a personal account belonging to Vanessa alone. Not joint. Not Daniel's. Hers. Frank also walked me through something I hadn't thought to check: the online reviews for the rental listing itself. Reading through them felt strange, almost like reading a diary someone else had written about my own life without knowing it. Guests raved about the cozy family home and the charming owner who left homemade cookies on the counter. One review, dated just 2 months earlier, said, "You can tell whoever owns this place really loves it, every detail feels personal." I sat with that review open on my screen for a long time. Someone had been playing house in a home meant for me, right down to the cookies, while I microwaved my dinner alone above a dry cleaner 3 miles away. Frank was careful to keep everything methodical. He photographed the property from the public street, never stepping onto it. He cross-referenced the booking calendar against the deposit dates in the bank records Rosa had helped point us toward, confirming line by line that the numbers matched almost to the dollar. He even found a business license filing with the city, required for short-term rental operators, listing Vanessa as the sole responsible party. Every piece we added to the folder made the picture sharper, and every piece made it a little harder for me to breathe. "You're doing exactly the right thing," Frank told me one evening, as we sat at my kitchen table surrounded by printouts. "Most people want to confront first and gather proof after. That almost never works. You gather the proof, and then the confrontation takes care of itself." Over 18 months, that account had collected just under $91,000. If you're still with me, let me know. Comment still here so I know this story is landing the way I hope it is. Because this is the part where everything I'd quietly gathered was about to come face to face with the two people who'd built it. I didn't want a lawyer's letter to be the first thing that told Daniel the truth. He deserved to hear it from me, in a room where he could look at both of us and decide who he believed. So I invited them both to Sunday dinner at my apartment: pot roast, the kind Daniel used to beg for as a boy, mashed potatoes, a pie cooling on the windowsill the way it always had when he was small. Not because I wanted a perfect evening. Because I wanted an ordinary one. Liars let their guard down when things feel ordinary. Vanessa arrived in jeans for once, no designer heels clicking against my worn linoleum, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that had clearly decided the Mother's Day incident was safely behind us. Daniel hugged me tight and told me the pot roast smelled exactly like his childhood. For a moment, sitting at my small table with my son across from me, I let myself feel the ordinary warmth of it, even knowing what was coming. Over dinner, I steered the conversation gently. "I've been thinking about the Larkspur house," I said, keeping my voice light. "I drove past it the other day. It's lovely." Vanessa's fork paused for just a fraction of a second. "Oh, it really is," she said smoothly. We should get you the key soon, Mom. There's just a last bit of paperwork. Funny, I said. I noticed people staying there last weekend. A young couple with suitcases. Are you renting it out while the paperwork clears? Daniel looked up sharply. Renting it out? Vanessa, I thought it was sitting empty, waiting for the transfer to finish. Vanessa laughed, a beat too quickly. Oh, that's probably just the property manager doing a walkthrough, sweetheart. You know how these things look from the outside. With suitcases? I asked, keeping my tone as gentle as I could manage. And a listing online with 81 reviews? The table went quiet in a way that felt different from Mother's Day. That time, the silence had been confused. This time, it had weight to it. Daniel set down his fork slowly. What listing? He said. It wasn't really a question anymore. I reached over to the small drawer beside my chair, the one where I kept nothing more exciting than takeout menus for the past 6 years, and pulled out a plain folder. I'd practiced this moment in my head more times than I want to admit. I think it's time we all looked at this together, I said, and I slid it across the table toward my son. If you'd been sitting where I was, would you have laid it all out like I did, or waited even longer? Comment below. I want to know how far you'd have let it go before speaking up. Daniel opened the folder slowly. On top sat a printed copy of the county deed record, Larkspur Holdings LLC, registered agent Vanessa Bennett. Under that, the notarized letter from the title company, the one that quietly explained away why his mother's name had never appeared on the house he believed he'd purchased for her. Under that, printouts of the rental listing, the booking calendar nearly full for the past year, and finally, the bank records Frank had helped me organize, showing, line by line, nearly $91,000 moving out of a company he'd founded and into an account that belonged to his wife alone. I watched my son's face change the way you watch weather move across a field, confusion, then disbelief, then something harder settling in behind his eyes. This isn't what it looks like, Vanessa said quickly, her voice climbing half an octave. I was going to tell you, Daniel. I was managing it. I was going to fold the rental income back into the house fund once. Once what? Daniel said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which I'd learned a long time ago was far more dangerous than shouting. Once I built up enough to cover the closing costs properly, she said, tears rising fast, the kind of tears that arrive right on cue. I didn't want you to know I'd made a mistake with the initial structuring. I was fixing it. For 18 months, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. While your mother-in-law kept paying rent above a dry cleaner 3 miles from a house she was told was already hers. Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at the papers spread across my small kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a boy, where I'd helped him fill out his first college application, where I'd sat alone more nights than I can count wondering if he was doing all right out there in his glass house on the hill. Get out, he finally said to Vanessa, his voice cracking on the second word. I need you to leave. Now. She grabbed her purse, tears still falling, and walked out without another word, her sneakers squeaking against my linoleum in a way her heels never had. Daniel didn't chase after her. He sat at my table, head in his hands, staring at 18 months of quiet betrayal spread out in front of him like a map of everything he hadn't seen. Mom, he said finally, his voice raw. I'm so sorry. I trusted her with something that was supposed to be for you, and I never even checked. No, son, I told him, reaching across the table to take his hand the way I had when he was 7 years old and his father's car pulled out of the driveway for the last time. The mistake was never trusting. The mistake belongs to the one who broke it. Frank connected me with an attorney named Priya Kapoor, who specialized in financial fraud involving family trusts and closely held companies. When she reviewed the folder I'd built, she didn't blink. This is about as clean a paper trail as I've ever seen, she told me. Deed records, a notarized misrepresentation letter, bank statements showing diverted company funds, and a rental listing with a full public booking history. Most cases like this take months just to establish what you've already documented in 3 weeks. Daniel, once he understood the full scope of what had happened, didn't hesitate. He had Verdant Systems' legal team open an internal review, and within days it became clear that Vanessa had used her position managing family real estate matters to divert not just the Larkspur house, but smaller amounts from 2 other company disbursements over the prior 2 years, funneling them through Larkspur Holdings LLC under similar cover stories. The case moved through mediation first, then briefly into a courtroom when Vanessa's attorney tried arguing that the funds represented informal compensation for property management services she had performed for the family. Priya stood up, calm as still water, and laid the timeline out point by point, the notarized letter claiming privacy on my behalf that I had never requested, the rental income deposited into a personal account rather than the LLC's operating account, the 18 months during which I continued paying rent on an apartment while believing, because I had been told directly, that I owned a home I had never once been given a key to. Your Honor, Priya said, this was not property management. This was a systematic diversion of company and family funds, concealed through deliberately misleading paperwork, from an elderly family member who was never once shown the deed to a home purchased in her name. Vanessa's attorney tried one more angle before the ruling came down. He suggested that I, at 64, might simply have misunderstood the timeline of a complex real estate transaction, the same tired suggestion I'd heard whispered at me in other forms for years, the idea that an older woman's memory can't be trusted, that confusion is the simplest explanation for anything inconvenient. Priya didn't even raise her voice. Your Honor, she said, Mrs. Bennett kept a written, dated record of every conversation, every excuse, and every discrepancy over 18 months, cross-referenced against county deed filings, title company correspondence, a public rental listing with 81 dated reviews, and bank statements obtained through her son's own company. If this is confusion, it is the most precisely documented confusion this court has ever encountered. There was a small ripple of quiet laughter in the gallery, quickly hushed by the judge's expression. Vanessa's face had gone the color of the folder still sitting open on the table in front of her. The judge's ruling came down firm. Full repayment of the diverted funds, transfer of clear, unencumbered title of the Larkspur house directly into my name, and a formal finding of financial exploitation that would follow Vanessa through any future professional licensing she might seek. Daniel sat beside me through the entire hearing, and when the ruling was read, he reached over and took my hand the way I'd once taken his, all those years ago, when he was small enough to need it more than I needed anything back. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that courthouse. I felt something quieter. The particular piece of a woman who had simply insisted on the truth, even when it would have been easier to let it go. 6 weeks later, I moved into the house on Larkspur Street for the first time. Daniel carried the last of my boxes up the porch steps himself, sleeves rolled up, sweat on his forehead, laughing about how heavy I'd made a box that turned out to be nothing but photo albums. I sat that first evening on the wraparound porch I'd admired from a car window for years, watching the sun go down over a street I now actually lived on, and I thought about how strange it is that truth so often arrives quietly, long after the lie has already done its damage, but it still arrives. With some of the remaining settlement, once the house was fully mine and the legal costs were behind us, I sat down with Priya and Frank and told them what I wanted to do next. We started something small, a free consultation service, run out of a spare room at my church, helping older adults check property records, review notarized documents, and understand exactly what's being done in their name before it becomes a problem instead of after. We call it the Fenwood Trust Project, named for the little street above the dry cleaner where I spent 6 years paying rent on an apartment while a house that was supposed to be mine sat rented out to strangers a few miles away. Daniel comes by most Saturdays now. He answers phones, helps people print out deed records, sits across from strangers who remind him, I think, of the mother he almost lost track of without ever meaning to. He's slower to trust smooth answers these days, and I think that's not a bad thing for a man who runs a company as large as his. If you've ever had someone in your own family quietly rewrite the truth while smiling right at you, I want to hear about it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you believe, like I do, that the truth always finds its way home eventually, even when it takes a rented apartment, a stack of bank statements, and a folder passed across a kitchen table to get there, hit like, subscribe, and stay close. Next time, I'll tell you about another mother who almost lost everything to someone smiling right across her own dinner table.